As those of you who've been around me a while know, I am a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and probably my favorite non-inspired literature ever written, at least so far encountered, would be The Great Divorce. I just think that the depth of the content in that little book, which would only take you a Saturday to read. I mean, it's not a real ponderous piece, but it is so cram-packed full of seeds that will continue to sprout and grow new ideas and concepts for you from now on, probably. So if it sounds like I'm pressuring you to read The Great Divorce, I am. You should just read the book. It won't take you very long, and it will bless you. In the introduction to The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis makes the statement that he believes that heaven and earth are not distinct places. He says, I think that when, and I'm butchering this, but basically he says, I think that when you get to heaven, you will look back and see that all along earth was just a region of heaven. Isn't that just a fantastic concept? And he says, in the same way, hell and earth are not distinct places. He says, if you are in hell at the end and you look back, you will find that earth and hell, that hell was just a region, or earth was just a region of hell. So I love that concept, that because I think, and I touched on this last week a little bit, I think that we have been that our thought processes have been so polluted by the general cultural, what's the word I'm looking for? Icons, probably. What does an angel look like? Well, most of us know what an angel looks like because we've got one probably still on the top of our Christmas tree. And, we have all of these concepts that have been etched into our minds. They're biblical concepts. Are there really angels? Yes. Are they these dainty looking, beautiful, kind of feminine looking characters with wings? Probably not. In fact, I'm not sure where the concept of angelic wings even came from. I know there's the cherubim on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, sure, but we have these cultural icons. Anytime that you see a picture of heaven, what do you see? And I'm not necessarily asking you to answer, but don't you almost universally see like just this cloud, these billowy clouds? We just sang a song about going to a place where there are no clouds, and I'm thinking, well, that totally destroys the concept of heaven for most people, because most people have this, and I know we don't. I mean, if I were to call you up and say, hey, what do you think heaven's going to be like? I don't think any of you would say, well, we're all going to be sitting around on a cloud playing a harp. The idea that there's this, that when we close our eyes and think about heaven, it's almost impossible for us to picture anything but what has been fed to us by the Renaissance painters and Dante and his horrible Inferno, and so it's not easy for us to entertain new ideas about heaven and hell, and I think it's important for us to try to iron out. I think it's important for us to try to get rid of these concepts and entertain new ideas, and that's one of the reasons why I think C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, it does a great job of at least challenging those iconic images that show up when we bring up these lofty ideas like heaven and hell and that kind of thing. So shifting gears, I dread the day that Sabrina says, "Can you help me get the Christmas stuff out of the attic?" And not because I have anything against Christmas, but because my world becomes cluttered at that point. I mean, there's all these boxes, and it seems like there's no way. First of all, how did we get all that junk in the attic to begin with? And now, what are we going to do with all of this stuff? We're not going to hang most of it up. And so there's this Christmas clutter that comes this time of year. Most of you are quite familiar with it, I'm sure. It's like barnacles. I was looking for I couldn't find a better picture, but there's a whale with barnacles on it. These barnacles, cling to the creature, and some of the videos that are out there, I mean, the whale is just covered in these barnacles. So I think we have this narrative that begins in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But over the years, we've hung all of these barnacles on it. Barnacles like elves and reindeer and chubby chimney climbers and drummer boys, and then we've got shopping and gift wrapping and the crazy schedules, and all of this it's clutter that's been hung on the biblical narrative of the birth of Jesus, right? And sometimes it's difficult to see the whale underneath the barnacles. That's what I'm trying to say. So last week I talked about this, and by the way, this is content that's coming in a great deal more detail in this deep dive on the kingdom. But the idea of dimensions, when I talk about 3 dimensions or 2 dimensions, anybody in here ever driven a remote control race car or remote control car? Yeah. So yeah, I got some people giving me. So you only have to deal with 2 dimensions, X and Y, right? You're either going forward and left, or forward and right, or back, and etc. You just have 2 dimensions. So recently I bought a drone. Now I'm here to tell you, a drone, a flying camera. Things get really complicated when you add another dimension, right? So now it's not just left and right, forward and back, but it's up and down. And there's telephone poles and trees and all sorts of things. So that 3rd dimension really makes a big difference, right? So we have a tendency, those of us human beings, we have a tendency to think in terms of mostly being occupants of a 3-dimensional world or a 3-dimensional universe. And then, as I mentioned last week, some folks will say, well, that on top of that, there's time, which, not only do you have latitude and longitude and altitude, but you also have, the 2nd of January 2022. So you won't be in this altitude and latitude and longitude, 3 hours from now, right? So we navigate, there's 4 dimensions, and then, the string theory people would say, well, there's a lot more dimensions than that. And I'm not really interested in getting into that, but what I am interested in saying is that that we are multidimensional creatures. that we occupy both the realm of nature and the realm of the supernature or supernatural at the same time. And so last week, since I didn't have this slide put together, I just had you kind of imagine this idea of these two circles, one being the circle of supernature, which is where God lives, and some folks would say, well, that's heaven. And then you've got this other circle, which is, nature, which is where we live. And then we have this idea that at some point, we have this idea that we're walking along in our earthly or natural realm. We're walking along, and sometimes we're in the good, and sometimes we're in the bad. And, and God's sitting there, with his 10-key calculator, well, Renfro was 5 minutes in the bad today, and the rest of the day he was all in the good. And so, he's calculating up the points. And at the end of time, or at the end of my life, I reached this point where God and I have a sit down, and he calculates up, what my score is, and then I get to go to heaven and be with him if I've got, an 85% or better, or whatever. And so I mentioned last week that there are so many reasons why that narrative is flawed, not the least of which is it is very self-centered. It's all about me. That's part of the problem. And then the rest of the problems that are that narrative has, revolves around, well, pretty much the New Testament. So the New Testament says that's not the way it works, that God doesn't function that way, that we're saved by grace, and it doesn't have anything to do with our performance. It has to do with the performance of a fellow by the name of Jesus, who God loans me his score, shall we say, and I get to carry that. And I know it's too good to be true, and just deal with it, because that's the New Testament and the concept of grace. But so we have the realm of nature, and we have the realm of supernature, and then I don't know if you can see this from where you're sitting, but the two circles are one and are overlapped, right? So if you go back to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, there is this period of time in human history where these two overlapped and were completely one. And God's moving in and out of his of human in human contact. He's moving in and out with them. He's walking in the cool of the evening with them, and they're one with him, and he's one with them. And there's angelic beings, and I mean it's like where were these guys living? Well, latitude, longitude, and altitude, we kind of know. I mean, we know where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together, and basically what the... So, from a three-dimensional point of view, we know basically where the Garden of Eden was, but it seems like it seems like heaven is on earth, right? Well, there's a reason that it seems like that, because heaven was on earth. That this is where God intended to dwell with man, and there's this intimate relationship between God and man. And then man said, John's rough paraphrase, man says, I don't want to take my moral cues from God anymore. I want to figure out what's right and wrong on my own. And so man rebels against God. And so when that happens, there is... And by the way, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't expect you to answer, but I do want it to trigger a little digging on your part. Does God say in Genesis 3, as he's confronting the rebellious man and woman, does he say, I will curse the earth? Or does he say the earth will be cursed? Yeah. So is there a difference? And I don't know. I'm not sure that it's important yet. But I do think that when you remove God from the equation, curses follow. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So as America has pushed God out, it seems like the curses have just come in. Right? They just come in to fill the void. So it's something that I'm toying with and haven't really gotten to the point where I'm ready to etch it into my theology yet. But I'm toying with the idea, God didn't curse the earth. The earth is just cursed as God withdraws from the natural realm. Right? It's just, as God withdraws, curses come in to take his place. But that being said, there is this, in the Old Testament especially, there is this overlapping of the natural and the supernatural realms. And it's basically this little area that overlaps is an embassy. Can I use that term? Because I want to get you guys starting to think about rule and reign of God. And the idea that God, there's this fragmentation of the relationship between God and man. And so man has established its independence. And so God creates this little embassy on planet Earth, and he calls it a tabernacle. And he has these ambassadors called priests and prophets who represent the matters pertaining to his rule. God leaves up to these priests and prophets as ambassadors in this embassy called a tabernacle or a temple. And even before the tabernacle, you'll find over and over again in the Old Testament, and so-and-so built an altar and worshiped God there. Well, at that place, there is this overlapping of the supernatural and the natural realm. And it wasn't that God doesn't need a pile of rocks, right? He doesn't need a church building. He's completely, in fact, doesn't Paul say that in Acts chapter 17? As he's delivering his sermon on Mars Hill, and he says, God's not served, by human hands as though he needs anything. What do you have that God really covets? Right? I mean, in a physical sense. What do you own that God says, man, I wish I had Brent Morris's truck, right? God doesn't need Brent Morris's truck. It would slow him down, right? So there is this what I'm going to call embassies that God creates or has created, where man can come back and to some extent experience what the garden was all about, the garden relationship. So interestingly, if you look at, and I'm not going to do this now, but I challenge you to do it, go and look at the description of the tabernacle or the description of Solomon's temple. Go and look at those, and you're going to see over and over again, well, that is a picture of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. All sorts of fruit-bearing trees and cherubim and all of those things are designed to pitch man and his focus back to the place where the train left the track in the garden. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So I want you to look with me at John chapter 12, verse 27 in John chapter 12. Now my heart is troubled, Jesus says, And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. So what hour is he talking about? Yeah, so he knows where he's headed. He knows what's coming. And experiencing life the same way you and I experience life, he's got some anxiety, right? So he says, now my heart is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very hour that I came, or for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, he says, glorify your name. And then, watch this, a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. And the crowd that was there and heard it said that it had thundered. I love that. And others said, no, an angel had spoken to him. And Jesus said, this voice was for what? This voice was for your benefit, not mine. Well, he didn't need God to affirm. You know, God's doing this for the sake of the people listening, right? So he says, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for the kingdom. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world shall be... Who? The prince of this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw them into myself. So this passage, and just for time's sake, we're not going to do it. But this passage in 12:31 and 14:30 and 16:11 of John, all three mention this prince of the world. Right? Well, who are we talking about? Yeah, we're talking about the Satan, as Andrew talked to us several weeks ago. This is the prosecution. This is the prosecuting attorney. This is the one whose job it is to drive a wedge between Dan Green and God. It's this force that's, constantly working to overthrow God's rule. And so Jesus makes these statements in these three passages, 12:31, 14:30, and 16:11 of John. He says the prince of this world is on his way out. Now, that was how many years ago? Roughly? Well, a couple of thousand, yeah. Is the prince of this world still hanging around? Yeah. But he's wounded. And I know initially, so we're talking about walking by faith. Initially, our knee-jerk response is to say, well, it doesn't seem like he's wounded. It seems like it's worse now than it's ever been. And I'm here to tell you, you're looking through the eyes of the flesh. God is in the process of restoring His rule and reign on this planet. And we're going to go through some difficult times as that happens, but He, and this is such a deep study, so good. In the year 3D AD, Yahweh drastically changed His approach. Before that, He worked through, and by the way, this is Hebrews 4 and lots of other places. In times past, God spoke to us in many ways, the Hebrew writer says, through prophets and etc. But in these last days, He's not doing it that way anymore. In these last days, He's speaking to us how? Through His Son, right? In AD 3, so we got the calendar thing all messed up, but in 3 AD, Yahweh changes His approach from working through embassies and ambassadors to sending his son. This is the whale underneath the barnacles. This is what that baby born in that barn outside of Jerusalem, that's what this is about. It's not about, and I don't have any problems with giving gifts and singing Christmas carols and all that. I love that as much as anybody probably, but it does get cluttered, and it to some extent derails the New Testament narrative that baby born in that manger. Tim kind of challenged some of those pictures. Was it last week or the week before? But this idea that the cry of that brand new baby heralded the fact that Yahweh had pulled on a nature suit and had stepped into our three-dimensional world and is no longer going to function as behind a veil. He's no longer going to function with ambassadors and embassies and etc. In fact, the interesting thing is, John chapter 1 verse 14, and I mentioned this last week, I think, that the statement is made, in the beginning was the Word, Word was with God, the Word was God, all things came into being through Him, and apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And then in verse 14 it says, the Word became what? Flesh. And your Bible, if you're reading an NIV anyway, your Bible says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that's okay. It's not an accurate translation. The most accurate translation is, the Word became flesh and tabernacled with us. He became the tabernacle. Where Jesus was, there's that overlapping. In fact, I think I've got that on the next slide. So I want you to just jump over to Isaiah. Actually, just for time's sake, just jot down Isaiah 9 verse 6. You guys know it by heart. It's an obscure, veiled. In fact, if you were a Jew back in 20 BC reading that passage in Isaiah, you would come across this statement that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Mighty God. What? And then Isaiah goes on to say, and the government will be on his shoulders. And the Jews who read that 20 years before the birth of Jesus would have said, what in the world does that mean? I mean, read it in context. It's like, you remember when they put the speed bumps in the children's home? You remember the first week? There wasn't anything that I recall that said, hey, there's speed bumps here. And, I was cruising up that hill and hit that speed bump and boom. I mean, it was like transmission was laying, a few feet from the vehicle. So those were some serious speed bumps. That passage in Isaiah, in Isaiah 9 verse 6 is such a literary speed bump. I mean, you're reading along and God's talking about these other nations and how He's going to bring judgment on them. And then boom, right there in the middle of all of that, there is this, oh, and by the way, a virgin will conceive and bear a son. We're going to call him Mighty Counselor, Prince of Peace. But all of these things that we now recognize as being in line with Jesus, right? And then this statement, and the government will be on his shoulders. So this idea that God invaded enemy territory, the prince of this world held all of the natural realm, and the Prince of Peace comes in the form of a little baby and invades enemy territory. So, in conclusion, walking by faith is living as though the rightful ruler is at this very moment growing his rule and reign here on this planet. And sometimes it's hard to see with the physical eye, but you've got to embrace it with the eye of faith. Paul will talk about that in Ephesians 2. And number 2, each one of us has a vital role. We were talking about this some in our Bible class this morning. To play in this new kingdom. In fact, the New Testament says you're all temples. What? And you're all priests. And you're all the sacrifice. So, we'll talk about more of that coming up, God willing.